inappropriate sampling methods. So if a sampling method does not involve randomness, then it is not an appropriate sampling method. So if we are just picking individuals for our sample without using any kind of randomness, then we have an inappropriate sampling method. Usually these are called convenience samples. So a convenience sample is a sample in which the individuals are easily obtained and not based on randomness. So that's our definition here. So I would kind of not emphasize as much the easily obtained as I would not based on randomness. Whether or not the sample is easy to obtain, if there's no randomness involved, then we have a convenience sample, and that is an inappropriate sampling method. Now, usually a convenience sample is a sample where data is really easy to obtain, so that's why a company or an individual might want to use that instead of doing an actual random sample. So for example, suppose you wanted information about Lewis and Clark Community College students. So suppose that you have, say, 10 friends that are Lewis and Clark Community College students. If you obtained your information just from your 10 friends, that would be an inappropriate sampling method. Your friends are students, right? But your friends aren't randomly selected, and so the information that they provide you in your study is not necessarily going to reflect what's true about the entire population of Lewis and Clark students. So you could probably obtain the information relatively easy because it's from your friends, but because there's no randomness involved, the data that you obtain is probably not going to represent the full population. Caution: any studies that use convenience sampling generally have results that are suspect. Results should be looked upon with extreme skepticism. So again, it's easy to obtain information as a general rule, which is why it's called convenience. But the downside of convenience is most likely the information that you're obtaining is not really going to be true about the entire population. Okay? For that to be the case, we need randomness. And so we'll learn more and more about this as we go into inferential statistics later on in the semester. But your inferential statistics are going to be useless if your sample's obtained inappropriately. A very popular convenience sample is called a self-selected sample, or sometimes it's called a voluntary response sample. When we have a self-selected sample or a voluntary response sample, the individuals themselves decide whether or not they're going to participate in a survey. So for example, if you ever listen to like talk radio, or if you ever watch like C-SPAN or any kind of a political show, they often have like daily polls, for example. So again, maybe the question might be, how do you feel about the president's handling of the coronavirus in our country? That could be like the daily topic that a talk show is talking about. And so they might ask their listeners, call in and give us your opinion. Do you think President doing a good job or not so good job handling the coronavirus? So if I were to ask that question on a talk radio show, who do you think is going to call in to give their opinion? So the people who really favor the president's performance, or the people who really disfavor the president's performance, they're going to be the ones who are most likely to call in and give their opinion. They are choosing whether or not they're going to provide information to the talk radio host. So again, most likely that's not going to represent what's really true about the entire population, because there's not randomness involved. Now, again, what the author says here is popular convenience samples are self-selected samples, also called voluntary response samples, in which the individuals themselves decide to participate in a survey. Now, I do want to be clear about this. if we're dealing with surveying, there is always a little bit of an aspect of self-selection. What I mean by that is, have you ever received a survey and you've chosen not to complete it? I have. Like someone calls on the phone and asks me to take 15 minutes to provide information. And if I'm busy, I'll be like, no, thank you. I'm not going to provide information. Now, if I'm not busy, I got 15 minutes to kill, maybe I would complete their information. Anyway, the point is when someone's selected to complete a survey, they can choose not to. That's always the case. So there's an aspect of self-selection here, but that's not the same thing as what we're talking about right here. What we're talking about here is the individual is literally deciding, I'm going to be a part of the sample or I'm not going to be a part of the sample. Whereas in a legitimate scenario, like the individual who calls to ask you to complete a survey, you were randomly selected to be called. So there was randomness involved. Now you can choose not to participate, but there was still randomness. Whereas like calling in to a talk show, there's no randomness involved there. Okay, so that's the big distinction. So quickly here, let's look at this example. So we want to identify the type of sampling used. So is it simple random sampling, stratified sampling, systematic sampling, cluster sampling, or convenience sampling? So 4 of those are appropriate sampling methods. And then of course we have the convenience sampling method, which is not appropriate. So question A, a member of Congress wishes to determine her constituency's opinions regarding estate taxes. She divides her constituency into 3 income classes: low-income households, middle-income households, and upper-income households. She then takes a simple random sample of households from each income group. So is that a simple random sample? Is that a stratified sample, a systematic sample, a cluster sample, or a convenience sample? This is stratified. The congressperson divides by income. So the groups are homogeneous, they're similar, and then she's randomly picking some individuals from each group. So that makes it a stratified sample. Question B, to determine the prevalence of human growth hormone, HGH, use among high school varsity baseball players, the State Athletic Commission randomly selects 50 high schools. All members of the selected high school's varsity baseball teams are tested for HGH. So again, simple random, stratified, systematic, cluster, or convenience. So we have a population of baseball players, specifically varsity high school baseball players, right? And they're wanting to test for HGH. So I don't know how many different high schools there are, say, in the state of Illinois, but I would think there's probably 600 to 700 different high schools at least. And that's public, and that's not counting private. So maybe as many as 1,000 high school varsity baseball teams. So they're randomly selecting 50 entire teams. And of the teams that they select, they test every player. So that is cluster. They're choosing clusters to test. C, Intentional Fitness Club wants to administer a satisfaction survey to its current members. Using its membership roster, the club randomly selects 40 club members and asks them about their level of satisfaction with the club. So again, simple random, stratified, systematic, cluster, or convenience. So they are interested in getting information from their members. And so I don't know how many that is, but let's say it's 1,000. They got 1,000 members that attend their club. And so they're just randomly picking, right, 40 of those 1,000. So that's a simple random. Now, it doesn't specifically say how they go about it, but presumably they're going to like number them from 1 to 1,000 and they're going to select 40. It does say they're randomly selecting them, so that makes this a simple random sample. How about D? A radio station asks its listeners to call in their opinions regarding the president's performance. In this case, there's no randomness involved. So this is a self-selected situation. Last but not least, the presider of a guest lecture series at a university stands outside the auditorium before a lecture begins and hands every fifth person who arrives, beginning with the third, a speaker evaluation survey to be completed and returned at the end of the program. So simple random, stratified, systematic, cluster, or convenience. So in this particular case, it is systematic because we're choosing every fifth individual. We're only giving the survey to every fifth individual, starting with the third. So number 3, number 8, number 13, and 18, and so on, to get the evaluation form. So the last thing in this section, the author discusses multi-stage sampling. And really the idea here is that in order to do an appropriate sampling method, it doesn't have to be strictly one of these types of random samples over the other. They could be interchanged and mixed. So we could obtain part of our sample using simple random sampling, and we could obtain part of our sample using systematic sampling, and we could obtain part of our sample using stratified sampling, and so on. So there could be multiple elements to our sampling method. What's important is that we have randomness, not specifically so much whether it's stratified versus systematic versus simple random or whatever. So the author talks about that, and you should read about this in the book to get more detail. But in practice, most large-scale surveys obtain samples using a combination of the techniques just presented. As an example of multi-stage sampling, consider Nielsen Media Research. So Nielsen Media is a company, if you're not aware, they have the Nielsen ratings, which like rates how popular TV shows are and those kinds of things. And it ultimately affects what a TV station can charge for advertising during a particular show. Anyway, so Nielsen tracks who's watching what. They also do other things nowadays, but basically who's watching what TV shows or how many and how popular is a show and that kind of thing. Well, they use multi-stage sampling. So Nielsen uses US census data. They divide the country into geographic areas, and the geographic areas are the strata, okay? So people who live in similar regions. The strata are typically city blocks in urban areas and geographic regions in rural areas. About 6,000 strata are randomly selected. So they divide the United States, let's say, into these regional strata, and I think they're basically trying to make similar kinds of numbers. Nielsen sends representatives to the selected strata and lists the households within the strata. The households are then randomly selected through a simple random sample. So again, they're listing all of the households, and then they randomly select some of the households to be included in their Nielsen ratings data information. So they're using partly a stratified approach, and then they're using partly a simple random approach. So again, anytime you have a really large scale study, it's very likely that they're using multiple methods rather than just using a single method. Okay, so there can be combinations, and that's perfectly fine as long as we have randomness.